Good evening. I'm Kerith Conron, Research Director at the Williams Institute, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to LGBTQ Parenting 2020, Lessons from the Front Lines and the Challenges Ahead. Tonight, we acknowledge the 2.5 million LGBTQ parents who are raising 5 million kids under the age of 18, and discuss how changes to the Supreme Court and the upcoming Fulton case could impact these families. First, let me introduce our panelists. Victor Self is Vice President of Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging for Barry's, a global fitness company. Victor is joined by his spouse, Chris Fraley, who is the Chief Investment Officer of Realty Mogul, an online real estate investment company. Victor and Chris live with their daughters, Coco, age 10, and Kiki, age 8, in LA. Asha Leong is a healer, coach, and trainer focused on helping queer, trans, people of color heal from trauma and thrive. She is the founder of Dreaming Desires and the Sexual Liberation Collective, and has served on the boards of Collage and the National Queer Asian Pacific Islander Alliance. She is the mother of a 5-year-old boy. Michelle Garcia is an attorney with New Mexico Legal Aid. She manages LGBTQ plus legal access program, Safe to Be You, which focuses on civil rights litigation in rural and indigenous communities in New Mexico. Michelle and her wife are foster parents for the state of New Mexico. Meet Alex Gomez, the former project coordinator for the Pathways to Justice project at the Williams Institute. She is a curandera scholar activist whose writing and research centers queer mothering, healing, and reproductive justice. She is the parent of a 3-year-old. And lastly, but not leastly, Gary Bailey, the Assistant Dean for Community Engagement and Social Justice at Simmons University. Gary is a professor of practice at the Simmons School of Social Work and has an appointment at the School of Nursing and Health Sciences. Professor Bailey is currently the President, Board of Directors of the National Association of Social Workers. And with this, Gary, I thank you and I turn the moderation over to your hands.
Good evening, everyone, and it is a pleasure to be with you. Greetings from a rainy Boston, and I'm looking forward to this conversation with the people who are on this panel, and so why don't we get started. So I'd like to begin by having people to describe their parenting story, your parenting journey, to share with us if it was via adoption, ART, surrogacy. Just introduce us to your process. And so why don't we start with Victor and Chris?
Well, it was certainly quite a journey, that's for sure. We actually have, as Kerith mentioned, we have 2 daughters and we had them through surrogacy. We worked with an agency. And when we had our first daughter, we were living on the East Coast in New York, and our surrogate was on the West Coast. So there was a lot of travel back and forth because we wanted to be very actively engaged in the process with our surrogate and her family. It took us quite a while to have our first daughter. Took us almost 3 years. And you know, our fertility doctor said, like, you know, most couples face 1 challenge or 2 challenges. You've literally faced almost every single challenge. And we were really at the point where we thought we would give up and try to create our family differently. And just as we did that, we got pregnant. And then our second daughter, we had like start to finish in about 11 months. So it was definitely a journey and 2 completely different and unique experiences with both kids.
So did you choose a particular venue because of cost, legal barriers, et cetera? Did you choose surrogacy for any specific reasons or just out of curiosity?
For me, there was, initially wasn't so concerned about a biological connection to the child, but along the path to creating our family, I lost my father very suddenly. And when that happened, I just really felt like I wanted a biological connection to my child. And that's really what led us down the path to surrogacy, because at first we were really looking more at adoption.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. Asha, Can you share
Hi
your
there.
journey? Hi.
Sure. So I am a queer solo parent by choice. So I embarked on this path to parenthood on my own, and was very lucky to be successful quite quickly with my son, Finn. And I think for me, this was in part, cost related. I also used a known donor versus a sperm bank, and that was in part a cost decision as well. Also in part there were only 14 mixed race donors in the whole country who were Asian. So, finding one in my network kind of met my requirements a bit better.
Only 14? Only 14?
When I did the search in terms of any of my Asian ethnicities, which are many, there were only 14 in the whole country. I searched everybody.
Wow.
So I was lucky. I was very lucky to be able to ask a friend who, in true queer fashion, we had both served on the same board of directors together and known each other over many years. And it's been a really incredible, fruitful experience. I think there's a lot of fear around using known donors, and I have to say, for me, it's worked out completely ideally.
Great. Thank you for that. Michelle, your journey.
Hello. My wife and I were originally living in the Deep South in Louisiana when we started first discussing our future plans to become parents. And one of the major factors back then in 2013 for us relocating to New Mexico was that at the time in Louisiana, like many other states, there were not options for us to become foster or adoptive parents through the state. And so one of the big reasons that we ultimately decided to relocate to New Mexico, where we ultimately became licensed as foster parents, was because we thought that there would be far fewer legal barriers and that there would just be a greater acceptance in kind of the local communities in the Southwest. For us, foster parenting was a very conscious choice that we made because at the time I was working as an SVU prosecutor for a special victims unit, and my wife was working in the public school system. And so we saw a lot of the really nasty side of what was happening with children being removed from a variety of different home situations. And we thought that there was a real opportunity for us to get involved on the positive side. And so in 2017, we had our first long-term placement, and she continues to be a member of our family. She was a teenager at the time. And I can say that for us, foster parenting was a really conscious decision that we chose New Mexico in contrast to what was happening in the Deep South at the time. And it was because we saw a lot of barriers in the Deep South to becoming parents.
It's really interesting as you describe that journey. I'm involved with kids who are aging out of foster care. And so having people to help make that transition is so important for people to be able to even to think about going to college or where do you go on the holidays, et cetera. So that's really an interesting journey. Also, you moved from Louisiana to New Mexico. Is the Interstate Compact, the respect for the Interstate Compact, was that a question or a challenge for you or something you were thinking about?
So back then, I had actually worked on a legal case when I was still a clerk before I became a licensed attorney. And Adar versus Smith was sitting on certification to the Supreme Court of the United States, to the SCOTUS. And at the time, full faith and credit was not being extended between Louisiana and other states for a variety of different reasons, having to do with its own legal history and the differences in its laws. And so there were some very specific and unique difficulties to kind of the interstate flexibility that Louisiana posed compared to a lot of different locations. By contrast, New Mexico has much more open communication with its neighboring states. It has respected the rulings of other courts far sooner than many other states have. And I think it continues to be a pretty welcoming community when it comes to fostering. Great.
So since we're talking about legal precedent and the law, can we spend a little time talking about Fulton v. City of Philadelphia and what the implications are going to be or could be for LGBTQ individuals and particularly LGBTQ parenting? Is that an overreach or is that something that you are focusing on?
Certainly, I'm happy to discuss that. So the Fulton case is really interesting. It's currently sitting and has not yet been decided by SCOTUS, by the United States Supreme Court. And the facts of the case really center on the fact that the city of Philadelphia back in 2018 learned that two of their agencies that provided foster care services were asserting a religious objection and saying that they would no longer have same-sex couples serve as foster parents, which also then affected the parents that were eligible to adopt children from those facilities. Philadelphia then responded by saying that those agencies were in non-compliance. They needed to comply with non-discrimination agreements that they had for all of their foster care agencies. And Catholic Social Services sued the city and saying basically that they had a First Amendment right to opt out of those non-discrimination clauses. Back in 2016, there were a lot of states that were allowing religious exemptions to be asserted by a variety of different agencies. And when the Supreme Court last spoke on this issue, it seemed pretty clear that you could not assert a religious objection. But since then, there have been some major changes to the makeup of the Supreme Court. President Trump has appointed now 3 justices. He's responsible for 1/3 of the makeup of the Supreme Court with the recent appointment of Amy Coney Barrett and her confirmation by the Senate. And if I can maybe briefly go into her as a judge compared to her predecessor, Justice Ginsburg, we're seeing a major change here. We've basically replaced someone in Justice Ginsburg who was a reliable vote for the so-called liberal wing that was consistently on the side of LGBTQ plus parents, that consistently wrote opinions and read them from the bench and basically attempted to persuade and censor her colleagues so that the rights of parents could move forward and that LGBTQ families were being protected. Her replacement with Justice Barrett could not be farther from this. Justice Barrett was very clear in both her Senate confirmation hearings and also her time spent as a federal judge that she views the Constitution through 2 main lenses. The first is textualism, meaning that she chooses to interpret it based on how the Constitution would have been back in 1789, when obviously there were not rights extended to LGBTQ plus parents. And second, she views the Constitution through the lens of her conservative Catholic faith, which she has interpreted, pretty consistently as also being anti-same-sex. And I don't think it's an overreach to say that there are many people who work on the judicial side and in the legal world and were very heartened by some of the recent decisions that came out of the court, like the employment protections that we saw this summer with the Bostock decision. I think this was a false sense of security because now we're facing a Supreme Court that is probably the most conservative that it's been in almost 100 years. And one of the areas that I think the religious right has been very open about choosing as a battleground is this issue of carving out a religious exception that would basically mean that taxpayer dollars can now fund discriminatory actions like is happening in the Philadelphia case.
Wow. When you talk about textualism, and then Alex, I want to hear your adoption or parenting journey as well, and then coming back to the implications of this. When we think about going back to that kind of a 1700 interpretation of the Constitution, it doesn't bode well for me as a Black man. It doesn't bode well for me as a queer man either, since none of those, the lot in life for folks of color and anyone who is different really becomes very complicated. So that's a sobering description. Thank you. Alex, tell us your journey as a parent and how you came to parenting.
Hi, yeah, I am a queer and polyamorous mother. So prior to the partners I have now, I had biological kid with my former partner. And
how old is your child?
He is 3.
Ah, great age, great age.
So now he
and how do you talk?
Sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead. Now, in terms of your being polyamory, is that something that you thought about having a child? Was it something that was exciting? Was it something that you thought about in terms of relationship, et cetera? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really exciting because, and it's something that a lot of people in the polyamorous community talk about, right? Like having kids and what that plays out like. So it has been exciting for me, especially because one of my partners has a 4-year-old, so it just works out great. Like they have siblings. But yeah, it's exciting, and And I really enjoy the fact that they get to be raised by community, because it's really important to me for them not to be raised by one parent or two parents or just like in a nuclear family, but to have many people with many perspectives join in on the parenting.
Great, thank you. Thank you for bringing that perspective, and it's something that we will revisit. Victor, given the work that you do, what are your thoughts, or if you have concerns about the impact of this new configured court? It wasn't lost on me that the new justice was sworn in by Clarence Thomas. I couldn't think of anything more poking someone in the eye than to take I was going to say miscreant, but I will say miscreant replacement to Thurgood Marshall with another miscreant replacement to the great Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and then to put it in front of all of us. But as you begin to think about the Supreme Court decision, its impact on, what do you think about the impact on child welfare, their ability to refuse placement of children, their ability to exempt? Thoughts on that, you and Chris?
Well, I spoke last, you can go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're in a really difficult situation right now with, the swaying of the Supreme Court. I think, I think we'll have a lot of backward traction. It's a pretty scary time for LGBT families, for sure.
I mean, the first thing I thought was, selfishly, I thought, thank God we live in California, and thank God we've already created a family, and that and that our parenting journey in that way was already complete. I think I was not at all, the irony of Clarence Thomas swearing her in was not lost on me. And I have a lot of fear around it. And at the same time, I believe that there are moments like this that create momentum for additional attention, which I think can lead to important social change. So while I am obviously not happy with the reconfiguration of the court, I do think that it's galvanized our community in a way that possibly there had become a little bit of complacency. And I think that this is a moment where people realize they cannot be complacent.
Thank you. Asha, Michelle, or Alex, anything to add? Any thoughts on this from your perspectives, Asha?
Definitely. I think the thing about queer parenting is that for most of us, we don't accidentally fall into it. It's something we plan and dream and think about for a long time. And maybe it's just my perspective living in the South, but I also know the hustle that queer community will do in order to produce our families. And so while the protections may change and the landscape may change, I also know exactly what tactics we used, before, going back to adopting as single people, referring to partners as roommates. No, are these things we want to do? Absolutely not. But I do believe in our resiliency and the possibility of continuing to build queer family in the face of this appointment.
Great observation. Alex, any thoughts? Michelle?
I think Asha's point is correct. You can't legislate away the creation of queer families. That's not possible. They've always existed. I think historically they will continue to exist. But when the country chooses through the mechanism of the courts to strip our protections, I think it changes what queer parenting looks like. And I think it really changes the type of childhood that children are being raised in when parents don't have that level of protection. And Asha's correct. There are workarounds, they're different in different states. They look different depending on what state laws do or do not decide to pass in terms of a response to any kind of Supreme Court case. But from my perspective, I think what's going to be, the bigger shift is that for a brief moment in time in the United States, we've enjoyed this period where children were protected in the sense that queer families were not experiencing overt discrimination funded by taxpayers for a moment in time. That time is likely passing. with the Fulton case coming before the Supreme Court, and they've telegraphed to some degree what that decision is. There will be probably more telegraphing after oral arguments. And I think for those of us that work on the advocacy side, we need to be bracing for a response. Like Victor and Chris were saying, there are moments that can galvanize us to advocacy, and I think this is absolutely one of them. This can and I think should be turned into momentum for us to overturn the laws that do exist, the discriminatory barriers that are still on the books, and to really act in community to fight against this.
It would be very interesting to see if part of what happens in the queer community is an alignment. It is happening in some parts and it's not in others around the entire moment that we're in around racial reckoning. These are not separate issues. And the importance of being able to figure out the intersectional path for equity and real inclusion in this country, that's the opportunity. And so but it'll be very interesting to see if we're able to get those pieces together. Will be really interesting. Kerith, who's going to be the most impacted as we think about this from the work that you're doing and the Williams Institute has been doing? Who's the most impacted by Fulton if you were going to hierarchize, if that's such a word? I'm a professor, I just made it a word.
Certainly
boom, your word.
Kids in the child welfare system will be impacted. And among adults, men and same-sex couples would be the most impacted because the financial obstacles to creating biological kids for male couples are the greatest. 1 in 5 same-sex couples is raising an adopted kid among those who have children, as compared to 3% of different sex couples. And that percentage increases to 30% among married male same-sex couples who have kids. And so they for sure would have the greatest potential loss. And thinking about foster kids, about 3% of same-sex couples are raising foster kids among those with kids, as compared to about 0.5% of different sex couples. So Fulton would impact many same-sex couples as well as single adults, particularly those who can't pass as not being part of the LGBT community. It might also impact LGBTQ kin who wish to adopt or foster. And I think that's something we don't talk about enough in the LGBTQ community, that supporting kin care for kids in foster care, including among their LGBTQ aunts and uncles, is also something that we should be advocating for.
So I'm curious as we think about the challenges. Michelle has really shared with us in thinking about Justice Cooper and the way in which her view, her kind of binary view of the Constitution, looking at it in terms of the textualization, and then thinking about her own Catholic view. As we begin to think about all of this in terms of the impact on same-sex couples and marriage, is marriage at risk? Do people think, Chris, do you think that marriage might be at risk for same-sex couples or have concerns about that?
Sure. I mean, I feel like we've been in this battle for, the last 20 years of bouncing back and forth in various jurisdictions. And, I think with this current, the right is very focused and very well funded and very, mission oriented. And I think I don't think we should feel safe at all. I think pretty much anything's on the table, and with the current makeup of the court, I think there's a lot for us to be concerned about.
I mean, it's interesting. I'm sure the two of you and many people on this call remember the time when California was going through its moment where people had gotten married, the rush to marry, and then people being married and then removing the right to marriage. So you had the question was, would those marriages be recognized? What does it mean that other people don't have that right? So that we've been in this space before of kind of creating a separate and unequal system, or really thinking about the, we look at the Pope and civil unions or civil partnerships. I've forgotten what the language was that His Holiness had used. It's a move, but it still creates separate but equal, supposedly, and that has never worked in our society. So it's an interesting challenge, as we begin to think about this, Michelle, Alex, any thoughts, and Asha, on the threat to marriage and parenting, et cetera?
Some of these institutions that we're talking about are very, very, very long in making decisions. When we're talking about the Catholic Church and their positions, some of this theology has been refined over hundreds and thousands of years. And so to say that there has been a movement toward equality, even separate but equal, represents a very, very, very long process. I'm not sure that looking for allies, for institutions that are very, very, very long decision makers like that, is going to make a tremendous difference to people who are currently in the foster care system, or parents who are working within that mindset or seeking to do adoptions through the state. To be clear, this is mostly going to affect how taxpayer money is being spent and what's happening to people who are in public institutions, involved with the states. How that plays out will probably be dramatically different. Victor and Chris said earlier something to the effect of being grateful for being in California. I would expect that states that have always made a point of protecting LGBTQ families will probably continue to do so. And then other places like the Deep South, where Asha was speaking about, are probably going to do the opposite.
Thoughts from your perspective?
I think for me, I am someone who is not married and actually never really had a desire to be married, but I sure do care about equal access to marriage for queer community. And I think in the South particularly, marriage really does matter. It has been a social legitimacy for couples and families, and children have been a way of, getting over rampant homophobia from parents and grandparents, because everyone's willing to overlook some queerness for some grandbabies, from their perspective, I would say. So I think, I think it does matter, and while it doesn't affect my life personally, it certainly affects my future possibilities. And at the same time, I know that I'm able to parent without that particular protection.
Bell Hooks has said that oppression is not having choices, that one of the key hallmarks of oppression is not having choices. I've advocated for marriage. It's not something for me, but I want to have the right. I don't want someone deciding what my rights are and what my rights are not, and what my choices are and what my choices are not. I celebrate it, like many people here did with Obergefell, as being an important piece of legislation or judicial decision-making out of the Supreme Court. I'm wondering, Michelle, again, from a legal perspective, can one go in and undo Obergefell, or is it just by whittling away at it like we're seeing with the Affordable Care Act right now?
So the thing about the Supreme Court is that it's supposed to adhere to a doctrine called stare decisis, where we look at what happened before as a guide to the cases that are being considered now. However, two of the justices that are already on the Supreme Court before Justice Amy Coney Barrett became a member telegraphed very clearly that they wanted to accept a case about whether or not court clerks could be turning away same-sex couples seeking marriage certificates. They were unhappy with the fact that the rest of the justices did not vote to take this case up on certiorari. Now that they have a third vote, I would fully anticipate that that exact issue, or something very close to it, this question of whether or not someone who is a civil servant can turn people away who are seeking a same-sex marriage license or same-sex civil union certificate, whether or not that is legal. That case will come up again, because we know that they had 2 votes before, and now with the introduction of the newest justice, they will have 3. So could marriage be overturned? I think if the facts were within that intersection of religious exemptions, and how that played out with taxpayer money, it is possible that they would find that the First Amendment would trump the previous decision in Obergefell. What I've heard from constitutional scholars far more wise than me is that what they expect to happen over the next several decades, because these justices are relatively young, is that there will probably be a death by 1,000 paper cuts, where there are more and more and more exceptions brought to the court that states who choose to allow discrimination and put that on the books, perhaps in places like the Deep South, will be able to do so. And other states that choose to expand protections and make that part of their state law will also be allowed to do so. And so what you were talking about earlier, this existence of very separate and unequal states will exist again.
So does the role of the new appointees, the lifetime appointees to the federal bench, does that have an impact of moving this faster to the Supreme Court because it gets determined by what happens in the federal jurisdictions?
That's absolutely correct. So the Fulton case that I mentioned earlier, the facts in that case played out in 2018. We're probably not going to see a decision until 2021 on that case. It takes years for these cases to develop an appellate record. The judges that hear those cases, whether we're talking about the First Circuit, the Fifth Circuit, the Sixth Circuit, and how those cases are developed at the appellate level, at the trial court level, district court level, all the different levels of review that are happening, the judges get to write about them. That's how we make decisions in the United States. They have to write, they have to, state their opinions. There's sometimes evidence taken, depending on what type of review we're talking about. And so at every level that more conservative justices who share this worldview that LGBTQ families should not be protected, at every instance that we have those judges being able to shape that appellate record, the chance that that case successfully gets up to the Supreme Court and starts to that paper cut process becomes more and more likely.
So Kerith, from the Williams Institute view, what are you concerned about, or what are you anticipating being impacted by challenges to Obergefell?
Well, thinking about Obergefell and the symbolic significance of marriage as a marker of social status, we know at the population level, when there are laws that sort of ban marriage for same-sex couples or allow religious exemptions for non-discrimination protections, that this has implications for the mental health, at least in the short range for LGBTQ people. And we've also recently found the inverse of that association. When Obergefell was passed, we saw a rise in happiness and sense of well-being among LGBT people relative to non-LGBT people. So these laws have significance for how people think about themselves and whether they are viewed as first-class or second-class citizens. Thinking about sort of differential impact, of course, I'm always concerned about those living in poverty. And so folks with the highest rates of poverty would be most impacted. And that includes transgender people, people of color, and bisexual women. And the particular root of impact with marriage comes access to employer-provided health insurance for both partners and kids. And so healthcare costs are a significant cost for many people. And with the new Supreme Court, I think it's also likely that there will be challenges to the Affordable Care Act, which is
there's a case already.
Yeah, some of those inequities in terms of insurance coverage. So those are the folks I worry most about.
So it's interesting, Alex, this talking about poverty and thinking about the impact of poverty on our communities, on LGBTQ communities and families particularly. Can you talk a little bit about your work in this area and to really help us to understand the Poverty Project and what you've been doing have been doing at the Williams Institute, and just help us to think about the intersection of poverty, parenting, and queerness?
Yeah, so I worked at the Williams Institute as a project coordinator for the Pathways Project, which is a really large study, a qualitative study where we did about 100 interviews with LGBTQ folks in both an urban county and a rural county in California. And within this, we wanted to see what were the experiences of or the pathways into adult poverty among a diverse population of low-income LGBTQ people. And one of the major themes, both parents and non-parents alike, was that childhood poverty was a key pathway into poverty for LGBTQ people. So thinking about the cycle of poverty in that way. And a lot of times we think that LGBTQ folks, because they come out, they lose social support. But with this study, we found, well, actually it's generational, right? Like for a lot of LGBTQ folks, 73% of the people who we interviewed had experienced childhood poverty. Another thing that we found, which was not surprising, which was that many of those folks who had childhood poverty, race and ethnicity was a key factor, particularly for Black, Latinx, and American Indian. And they were very distinguished between the pathways into poverty. And among those, and then later on, like those who didn't experience childhood poverty, we saw that there were more common themes that we hear about, like anti-LGBTQ family rejection, mental health issues, substance use issues, into poverty. And particularly for parents, we kind of saw two themes come up. One had to do with custody. So folks from states outside of California talked about having to move to California. A lot of trans folks who were parents talked about wanting to move here, even though it was more expensive, because of their right to parent and their partners or previous partners threatening them for custody when they transitioned. We also hear about the intersection of race and queerness. So for a custody battle, I'm going to read a quote about a person who was trying to get custody of their child. And they say, quote, "Prior to everything, I funded my own attorney, and it was a white guy. He expressed to me that he wanted me to pay him upfront $1,400 to help him with preparations to go to court and help me get my kids back. But when he found out that I was in a lesbian relationship and that we were Black and from Compton or whatever, being that our skin color says that we're Black, he kind of like turned away from trying to help me and told me that I was Black and from Compton. So I didn't think I was going to get any help. Or think that I was gonna get any justice." So just an example, that was one of the examples that they gave in terms of racism, right? And queerness at the intersection. Another theme that we found among parents was shelters and housing insecurity and the difficulties they have in finding that. So we found some parents, for example, some transgender men have babies often before, but sometimes after their gender transition. So they went into shelters and they would have the person telling, one participant said, the places were for women and children. And they're like, yeah, well, technically you're a chick. And they said, I'm not. Legally, I'm male, like even on my birth certificate and everything. And so they won't put me in that program, you know, even for the benefit of my son. So it's just tough. They don't have programs for men or anybody in the community with children, and it just sucks. And this was something that came up not only from trans people, but also other LGBTQ folks bringing it up throughout interviews, saying that they're aware that these shelters, because other folks have children, that needs to be more expansive in terms of gender. Yeah, so those are some of the findings we have in terms of both all around LGBTQ folks' experiences within poverty and also specific parenting barriers.
So as we think about this, thank you for that, Alex, because that's really important and helpful information, and for people who really who make their decisions based on the metrics. So the qualitative, quantitative mix becomes really significant. Kerith, as we hear this kind of data, and are we able to compare and to think about, compare may not be the best word, of what it means to be an LGBTQ parent in poverty compared to those LGBTQ parents who are not living in poverty? It seems like an obvious The answers seem obvious, but very often they're not. So are there parenting differences in that dynamic?
Well, unfortunately, about a third of LGBTQ parents are raising kids in poverty. So the experience of parenting in poverty is common, as is the need to rely on public support systems, particularly when families of origin are unaccepting. So in the places where LGBTQ parents who have more money differ from those who don't is in their ability to try and reduce their exposure to unwelcoming environments and people. But these efforts to avoid LGBTQ stigma have a cost. As Alex just said, the cost to move to the state of California, which has very high housing costs, may be one of the reasons that we see lower rates of home ownership among LGBTQ people. And we hypothesize that avoidance is a contributing factor to this pattern. So thinking intergenerationally, as Alex just did, we may see fewer assets among LGBTQ parents, and this may impact the opportunities and socioeconomic trajectories of their kids. So I also want to note that avoiding LGBTQ stigma is just one piece of the experience for LGBTQ parents. Half of parents are people of color who experience racism at multiple levels. And so avoiding LGBTQ stigma, it may be more manageable for those with resources, but avoiding racism is something that may be more difficult.
So all of this is really interesting in terms of the amazing opportunities that have come via the law and have been really codified into our society in the last 20, 25 years, and really in the last 15 years has been amazing in terms of the recognition of our families, the recognition of relationships, how we define them across a broad spectrum. There's been enormous positive change. Lessons learned from my vantage point, lessons learned from the civil rights movement of the 1960s are the need for us to remain vigilant, because those changes aren't cemented. They are malleable and they can go away. If anyone had told me that we'd be not only talking about voter suppression, but it would be flagrant in 2020, I would have said you were lying compared to what was happening in 1965, and look where we are. To be able to think about the celebration of Oberfall, and now to think about if it's under attack requires us to stay vigilant. I'm just looking at a news story that said, as a social worker, we've been following very closely a move by the state of Texas, or the People's Republic of Texas, depending upon how you look at it, to require in some ways social workers to participate in discriminatory practice against LGBTQ individuals. And then that would put the contest between the rules of the state and the social work code of ethics, and it backs people up into a place whose trumps who, literally, and another pathway to a court case to decide religious freedoms, et cetera, that Texas has backed down today and is not moving to enforce this, again, because of the galvanized action that was taken by the social work community in Texas and around the country to push back against this. But these are the kinds of assaults and attacks that are going on now for our communities. And so as we think about what's currently happening, I'm wondering, what are the next steps as you begin to think about what some of the next steps are for us in terms of organizing our communities, protecting our families. Besides the advocacy, are there other steps that we can be taking? Where else should we, as we move into this election cycle, what else can we be doing to ensure that our families, no matter how they are configured, are supported to exist, not that they have to figure out how to sneak to exist? And I'm interested in everyone on the panel responding to that. Why don't I start with Asha?
I think that this is so, location and family specific. It's kind of hard to answer. But, you know, I think for me, from where I'm sitting, you know, I see the big picture in terms of the young people who are in the system, who are above the age of 7 or 10, are pretty much predominantly queer kids, at least in Atlanta, where I live. And, you know, knowing our capability as queer parents to care for LGBT youth, and thinking of all the barriers. And, you know, I grew up under sodomy laws in Virginia that literally, you know, queer sex was illegal. So
Right.
I think there are a lot of ways in which, one, we dream into the margins, and, like, you know, the laws don't come into our bedrooms or houses, but in other ways, you know, we're facing all of this structural discrimination, you know, from potential Catholic agencies, which, let's be real, you know, the Catholic agencies are placing a third of the children separated at the border, you know, that the reach is very, very deep in terms of foster care and adoption. So I think it's hard to respond because I see it both on the institutional as well as the, you know, individual level.
Okay. Thank you for that. And thank you for the reminder about the separation of children at the border, and where those children factor in, and particularly looking at and thinking about children who are so traumatized and whose trauma history, the power of their trauma journey is something that we're going to have to respond to. And putting people into families is one way to help. Putting them back with their own families would be the ultimate way, but putting them into loving families as a way of healing is so important. Thank you for that reminder. Victor and Chris, what are your concerns, thoughts about where we're headed with all of this?
You know, I think when we look back on the trauma of the current administration, I mean, one thing I think we're not completely focused on, as with respect to how it impacts families, is all the judges that have been appointed during this administration, which is a staggering number. And for families that either go through adoption or surrogacy, that is, the judge that you have in those rulings are critical, absolutely critical. I mean, even 10 years ago, and even in California, when Victor and I were having our kids, there were very specific judges that you went to and some that you didn't go to. I mean, some judges that would just pass through the pre-birth order immediately, and others, if you went to the wrong judge, you were in big trouble. So I think that, I don't know what group within the movement should probably tackle that. I mean, I think it would be a great project for the Williams Institute. I think our community would really benefit by just a guide on, you know, if you're an LGBT parent, if you're, you know, trying to get a second parent adoption order, like, there are judges that you have to avoid. And, or, you know, if you're looking for a pre-birth order for a surrogacy, I mean, there needs to be a guide of judges that, you know, just are really divisive towards our community. I didn't mean to cut you off. Did you have anything to add there?
No, I mean, I think that when you first brought it up, I just thought immediately it didn't apply to our movement. It did the you know, think globally, act locally. Like, that sort of like, you know, you really have to be sure that you're taking care of things locally, because that is generally what's going to have the most impact on your day-to-day life, and ensuring that and that you are speaking to your state legislators and your city legislators and your county boards of supervisors and your school boards and all that sort of stuff, because that's the stuff that can really impact on a day-to-day basis the lived experience of your families and your children.
Yeah, and that's really a very important reminder that we tend to focus sometimes up here at looking at the pieces, and we really do forget that. I tell my students all the time that if you are able to elect the dog catcher, really be involved in that, because you want to understand who the dog catcher is. and then going up and down the ballot becomes so very, very important. Michelle, thank you, Chris and Victor. Michelle, your thoughts on what lays ahead?
So I have a lot of thoughts, but I will be brief.
Okay.
I really think that in this moment, there's a lot of people who are very concerned about what's happening at the national level, and rightfully so. But to Victor and Chris's point, we have a much greater impact in our own backyard. You know, how we form community with others, you know, whether that's through mutual aid networks, whether it's through charity or giving of volunteer time, can be incredibly impactful to the people who live in our own community. That's something we cannot overlook. And our voting power, our ability to affect public policy, who gets elected, who writes the laws, how are they enforced, what values do they share or not share with our community, we have so much more power at the local level. You know, whether that's the dog catcher, the local school board. There are a lot of judicial races, I know we were talking about judges a second ago, where people are running unopposed, or they're merely running for retention after being appointed by a governor or another system in their state. And that's a place where you can have a lot of impact, and to really find out what are the values of the people who are going to get to rule on dozens or hundreds of the cases that we're talking about, you know, whether that's related to the foster care system, adoption, marriage, you know, these religious carve-outs. It has a massive impact on many, many, many LGBTQ plus families. And I think if we are looking for a place to get involved, you have to start by looking into your backyard. You know, I'm not trying to discourage anybody from being involved at the national level, but this is not going to have a uniform effect on every state. It's going to look very different the way that this plays out in the Southwest where I'm living compared to the Pacific Northwest or the Deep South or the Northeast. And so I think we have to be really, really cognizant and keep our eyes out for opportunities for us to really have that impactful type of difference.
So thank you, Michelle. And Alex, as we look through the lens of poverty and the impact that poverty has, and if we think of poverty as structural violence, you know, that it is Coretta Scott King said that ultimately poverty is the penultimate structural violence. How do we begin to shift that in a capitalist system? And that's a big question for a brief answer. How do you think that we might begin, given the realities of what we have? And I'll give you an example. There are a lot of people today who are wringing their hands because the market just basically went bluey tied to bad COVID numbers. So that determines for some people what's valuable and what's important. How do we help people to think about the issues of poverty and social change and moving in some ways to a more inclusive model?
Yeah. See, I was thinking about the question before, and it kind of ties into this question.
Okay.
So I
go to the question before and lead into.
I'm thinking about grassroots organizing and collectives, and so I'm part of Unidos Homeschool Collective, which is a practice of decolonizing education with our young ones. And so this is primarily almost everybody there is queer, almost everybody there is polyamorous. They're all POC. And so it's this really powerful space where our kids get to get together and learn together and learn in many ways and value different ways of knowing. That doesn't just, right, so different ways of knowing. And one of the interesting things is the first club that the young ones decided to start was an LGBTQ club, right? And they were really excited about it. And this has changed right through COVID. So before it was in person, and then now it's online on Zoom, and we meet once a month in person. But I'm thinking about ways that we can strategize how I think Asha said earlier that we always figure out a way to do it. We always figure out how to build community and get through it. So that's kind of what I was thinking about in terms of like folks who are low income, working class, how we manage, we build community, we build collective, and then
and make the change in that way. You know, it really is about that number of getting individuals to the table who want to make change and being able to hold them and support them as they're making the change is so key and so important. So as we're wrapping up, I really want to ask all of you in one sentence, if you can, to think about well, two sentences. What is your biggest concern for your children as we look forward to the future and we really think about, as parents, what is the world we hope that our children will be able to be a part of? So what is the concern? And then what is the hope for, and those can be the same or they can be very different. So Asha?
I think I have a concern about how our worldview as a queer family, a vegetarian family, very multiracial family, how that interacts with the larger world once he's able to step into it more himself. He's just 5 now. And I think one thing I look forward to is to continuing to deepen my community. I am part of many mutual aid systems here in Atlanta. I'm a volunteer with the Zero Food Waste movement. So I'm constantly rescuing food and moving it to people in need. And I think, one of the biggest things when we're talking about working class families is like the hustle. Because it's the hustle that makes up for the difference for families that are well resourced. And so I think I just want to close this thing. Like I see people's hustle in all of the different ways we've had to adapt and reinvent ourselves and our communities in this year.
Great, thank you. Victor and Chris, your concern and your hope?
I think my biggest concern is letting current circumstances instill in our kids a sense of hopelessness and fear. And I think that hopelessness and fear are counterproductive to change. And so, and since I believe that kids are who will ultimately facilitate meaningful change, I think it's really important that they remain hopeful in the face of adversity. And, I think, when I think about the world that I want them to inhabit, I mean, I grew up in the South in the 70s and with a lot of racial discrimination. And I was able to persevere and find opportunity and really thrive in life. And I want them to have a world where, despite how different they are and how they present, that they see themselves being able to thrive in a world that embraces, celebrates, and values the diversity that they bring to the table.
Great, thank you. Chris, do you have anything to add from your perspective?
No, that pretty much sums it up. I mean,
all right, I just wanted to make sure if that was the couple comment or if there were two individual comments joined together there. I just thought I'd check. Wonderful. Michelle, your hope and your concern and your hope?
I think similar to some of the other panelists, I see a lot of people being so scared and really sometimes making decisions or being guided by fear, by a scarcity mentality. And what I have found working in kind of this logical world of the law is that that's when we make some of our worst decisions. When we are guided by our fear, when we let that be the guiding principle to direct our actions. And so the hope that I would want to share is that it does not have to be that way. One of the statistics I think Kerith said at the very beginning is just how many queer families there are in the United States. And it is absolutely within our capability to change the landscape the way it is right now. And so even though things might seem scary, that people might be afraid of what's happening on the legal landscape, we absolutely have the power to change this using the tools that already exist in our representative democracy. I'm not saying it'll be easy. I'm not saying it'll be fast, but it is absolutely within our power to change. And so that would be the hope that I would want.
Great, thank you. And Alex, a hope and a concern and a hope?
I am just thinking about centering joy and pleasure in parenting. And I'm really excited about queer parenting because we really get to shift how we understand parenting. Like he teaches me so much and he has so much power and he helps me think about power and he navigates power creatively. And so I just have a lot of joy in learning from him in that way.
Great. Great, thank you. It's been a pleasure being able to participate and facilitate this discussion, and it's been such a rich and exciting conversation that we've had. Kerith, I want to bring you in to close us out with some parting words and some thoughts about the process. Thank you.
Well, as far as hope, I have hope in youth. 10% of young people are LGBTQ identified. About 2/3 of them imagine having families in the future. There's a lot of hope there. I think our opportunity for moving forward in the future is to build community, thinking about reaching out across what seem to be lines. 5 million LGBTQ people are religious. There is not sort of an us and them out there. That's a falsehood. I think that serves certain political agendas. And I guess I also want to conclude with a reminder that we need to think about the most vulnerable among our communities and remember that 1 out of 5 transgender people are parenting, and that access to homeless shelters is a concern for transgender people and something that we all need to fight for. And when we think about poverty, we need to think about workforce development. And so I think there are a range of ways that we can all partner as individuals and organizations, as researchers, scholars, and practitioners. So I have a lot of hope for the future. I think it will be challenging, but we, our children and young adults who are not yet parenting, I think we'll be able to work together and do some good. So thank you so much to Gary, our moderator, to Asha and Michelle, Victor, and Chris, and Alex for participating on the panel. Thank you to everybody else who dialed in and missed their dinner on the West Coast or on their favorite TV program if you're on the East Coast. Please reach out to us at the Williams Institute. We have a wealth of resources about the LGBT community on our website. We have a judicial training program, so we really do try to make sure that even judges know about the needs of our community, since they have such profound impact on our lives. So thank you, good night, be safe, and it was our pleasure to have you.